The iron gates of Hillside Cemetery had witnessed countless goodbyes. But on that quiet Tuesday afternoon, they bore witness to something else entirely. The moment a broken heart unknowingly stepped toward healing. Margaret Hayes paused just outside those gates, her breath shallow, her chest tight, as if the air itself demanded a toll before letting her enter. At 62, she was known in boardrooms and charity galas as a woman who owned half the skyline. Yet here, among the headstones, none of that mattered. Money had never been able to buy her peace. It certainly hadn't been able to bring her daughter back. 3 years had passed since Emma died, but time had only sharpened the ache instead of dulling it. Margaret came every Tuesday, always at exactly 3 in the afternoon, when the cemetery was at its quietest. It was her private ritual, her fragile routine, the only place where grief was allowed to breathe. She walked the familiar path slowly, her heels tapping softly against the stone, her silver hair glowing in the afternoon light. She already knew what she would say to the grave. She always did. But then she saw them. A man in a janitor's uniform knelt beside Emma's headstone, his shoulders trembling. Next to him sat a little girl, no more than 5 years old, wrapped in a yellow sweater, far too bright for a place like this. Her small hand clutched the man's sleeve as she cried, the sound barely louder than the rustle of leaves. For a moment, Margaret thought her grief had finally tipped into hallucination. No one else ever came here. This was her place, her daughter. Her heart began to pound as confusion turned to something sharper, possessive, protective. She quickened her pace, the quiet shattered by the echo of her steps. When she spoke, her voice carried years of authority and unspent sorrow all at once, demanding answers from a world that had already taken too much. The man startled, looking up with red-rimmed eyes. He was younger than she expected, mid-30s perhaps, his face lined not by age, but by exhaustion. His hands were rough, the kind shaped by labor, not luxury. The little girl shrank back, frightened, pressing herself against his leg, as though he were her only shield. Margaret's words hung in the air, heavy and accusatory, until she noticed what didn't belong. At the foot of Emma's grave lay fresh daisies. Not the expensive roses Margaret ordered every month, but simple flowers, carefully arranged. Beside them rested a small piece of paper, weighted down by a stone. It was a child's drawing, stick figures holding hands beneath a crooked rainbow, colored with earnest care. Something inside Margaret faltered. The man spoke, apologetic, his voice trembling as he wiped his eyes and helped the little girl to her feet. He clearly wanted to leave, to retreat from her grief before it turned into anger. But Margaret found herself lifting a hand, stopping him. Her voice softened as realization crept in that this moment, however painful, was not an intrusion. It was a question waiting to be answered. She asked how he knew her daughter. The man hesitated, glancing down at the child, who hid her face as if the world were too loud. He introduced himself as Daniel Foster and explained that the little girl was his daughter, Sophie. Then he said Emma's name, and when he did, he spoke it like a blessing, like a memory he carried close to his heart. Margaret felt tears rise instantly. Hearing Emma's name, spoken with such tenderness by a stranger, unraveled her composure in a way she hadn't expected. She invited them to sit with her, her instinct to push away replaced by a deeper need to understand. They moved to a nearby bench, beneath an old tree, its branches casting gentle shadows that swayed like memories. Daniel spoke slowly, carefully, as if the story itself were fragile. He worked as a custodian at Mercy General Hospital. 3 years ago, his wife Sarah had been diagnosed with cancer. They had little money, no insurance, and nowhere to turn. He worked 2 jobs, scraping by, trying desperately to hold a family together, while watching it fall apart. Emma had been Sarah's nurse. At first, Daniel explained, she was simply professional, kind but efficient. Then she began staying after her shifts, sitting with Sarah when the nights grew long and frightening. She talked to her, made her laugh, read to her when speaking became too hard. She treated Sarah not like a patient, but like a person who still mattered. As Daniel spoke, Margaret closed her eyes, picturing her daughter exactly as he described. This was Emma, always giving more than required, always staying longer than necessary. Then came the part that made Margaret's breath catch. Daniel couldn't afford childcare. On nights when he worked late, he brought Sophie to the hospital, leaving her in the waiting room while he cleaned floors. Emma noticed. Without making a show of it, she began caring for Sophie during those shifts. She brought toys and books from home. She taught Sophie how to draw. She created safety in a place filled with fear. Margaret whispered that she hadn't known. Emma had never mentioned any of this. Daniel smiled sadly, explaining that Emma never sought recognition. Helping was simply who she was. Sophie finally spoke, her small voice steady with innocence. She held out a worn stuffed rabbit and explained that Emma had given it to her. She had told Sophie that whenever she missed her mommy, she should hug the rabbit and remember that love never goes away. Margaret broke then. Tears streamed down her face as understanding crashed over her. After Emma's death in a car accident, Margaret had sorted through her daughter's apartment, puzzled by the children's books and toys she found tucked away. She had donated most of them, thinking they were remnants of some forgotten plan. Now she realized they had been evidence of a quiet legacy. Daniel explained that Sarah passed away 3 years ago. 2 weeks later, they learned of Emma's accident. With no family and no place at the funeral, they came to the cemetery instead. They talked to Emma. They thanked her. They kept coming. For 3 years. Margaret looked at the man before her, a widower raising a child alone, working tirelessly, still finding the time to honor a nurse who had changed their lives. She realized how small her own world of grief had been, how narrow. While she mourned alone in a mansion filled with silence, these two had been showing up with daisies and crayons. She apologized, not just for her harsh words, but for forgetting that grief does not belong to one person alone. Daniel gently told her there was nothing to forgive. Losing a child, he said, was beyond imagining. They sat together in silence as the light shifted, something new growing in the quiet. When Margaret finally invited them to dinner, it wasn't out of obligation. It was out of longing. A longing to know the woman her daughter had been to others. That dinner changed everything. Margaret's house, once echoing and cold, slowly filled with warmth. Tuesday afternoons became sacred again, but no longer lonely. Tea was shared. Stories were exchanged. Laughter found its way into rooms that had been closed off for years. Margaret learned that Emma had once snuck extra pudding cups to Sophie and had danced in the hallway with Sarah when pain meds kicked in. Daniel learned about Emma's childhood, her stubborn kindness, her belief that people mattered more than profits. Margaret helped Sophie enroll in a better school, She started a college fund, not as charity, but as continuation. Daniel fixed things around the house, teaching Margaret how to live with simplicity, how to measure wealth by connection instead of accumulation. Sophie began calling her Grandma Margaret. And Margaret, who once believed her life had ended with her daughters, discovered that love, when shared, does not divide. It multiplies. 6 months later, they stood together at Emma's grave. Sophie placed a new drawing among the flowers. 4 stick figures appeared on the page, 2 angels above, smiling, 2 figures below, holding hands. A golden thread connected them all. Margaret touched the headstone and whispered thanks, not for the loss, but for what had followed, for the proof that kindness outlives us, for the reminder that family is not always born, but often found. As they walked back toward the gates, Sophie slipped her small hand into Margaret's, and in that moment, Margaret understood what her daughter had always known, that the greatest legacy we leave is love that continues after we're gone. That sometimes, in our deepest grief, grace arrives quietly, dressed as a janitor and a little girl with flowers. If this story touched your heart, let it remind you to look for kindness where you least expect it, and to honor the love that still surrounds you. Don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that remind us we are never truly alone.